This process within our brains is a three-step loop. First, there's a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. Then there's the routine, which can be physical or mental or emotional. Finally, there's a reward, which helps your brain figure out if this particular habit is worth remembering for the future. That was just a little bit from Charles Duhigg's famous book, The Power of Habit, and here to discuss today is Andrew McEntyre. So Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate you letting me be a part of this.
Yeah, for sure. And I thank you for suggesting this book. It's been one I read years ago and I needed to dig back into. So this is a good excuse to do that. So why'd you pick it? Why The Power of Habit?
So I originally read this book about 5 years ago. The first connection I had to it was through education. So I'm a special education teacher. And in that book, there's a lot of elements that are very close to behaviorism. I work with students who typically have developmental disabilities like autism or intellectual disabilities. So what you just read there was very close to some of those key elements from behaviorism. B.F. Skinner, who came up with the idea of behaviorism through experimental treatments with almost like you have like Pavlov's dog and some of those things.
Okay, yep.
Came up with the formula SRR, which is stimulus, response, and then reinforcement. And so what you mentioned a second ago with the cue, routine, and reward are very similar to that same concept. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that whatever happens before and after a behavior will influence that behavior itself. And so when I read that book, that was the lens I was looking at it through, was how I could connect that over to my role as a teacher. Could I use this to help my students? At the time, I was also supporting other teachers. Could I help them also in their classroom? So that was the initial connection to the book. And then the very first chapter in the book, it's about a man called Eugene Pauly who had a brain damage that occurred from viral encephalitis. Mm-hmm. And when that occurred, he lost a lot of memories and he had a lot of those reasoning skills to be able to function throughout his day. But what they were able to realize is that his routines and his habits were still existing, and he was able to even learn new routines and habits, even with that brain damage. So what I took away from that was many of my own students have struggles with cognitive impairments, and I was noticing some of those same things, that they are able to learn a lot of habits throughout their day with that constant repetition. So that information about that cue, the routine, and reward really, it really connected to my own teaching. So that was the initial idea of what this book brought to me.
Gotcha. That's awesome. So do you very specifically do the cue, routine, reward with your students? Like, all right, students, let's talk about the cue. What is the cue that's going to matter? Like, you walk them through very deliberately, I assume?
I would say that I don't really teach my students. Right now I'm working with preschoolers.
Okay.
I don't go through and teach them like the logistical side of it, but we do definitely use these aspects. So for example, a lot of my students who are 3 to 4 year olds are working on toilet training. And so we may go in through that process and we use picture cues. And so that cue might be to point at a certain picture to get them to follow a certain response. And the goal of that is to kind of phase out or fade those prompts to where they're doing that routine on their own. But at first, you may have to actually point to that picture of what you want them to do to have them to, build that spark of that behavior. And then after that behavior occurs is when you do the follow-up, which is like a praise or a reinforcement. So that might, in some more intensive settings, that usually is like a reward that could be like a Skittle or an M&M, like you might think of toilet training. But for me, I really found that even praise, like making a big deal out of something, it really makes that same reinforcement or reward happen. So I definitely do use this daily, and we build these in to where it becomes more independent and they're doing it on their own.
Gotcha. Did it affect your behavior in any way? Did you change any of your habits or how you construct habits just in your personal life?
Yeah, I would say so. And one of the elements within this book that he brings up is something called keystone habits. Mm-hmm. And what that really is like a domino effect. So it's like one big habit that ends up creating other habits to occur. And so for my own life, there was a certain habit I think that did that, was walking. A few years ago, my work did one of those silly challenges like they do where you have to keep track of who's going to walk the most using like your smartwatch or whatever that may be. Right. And for whatever reason, it sparked this daily habit. So every day after I ate supper, I took my dog for a walk. And so it was almost became like that trigger or cue was I finished supper, I look at my dog and say, okay, my dog's looking at me, I want to go for that walk. Let's go do it. Nice. And then the behavior was that walk. And then when I came back, the reinforcement was almost just that benefit of being able to feel good about being out there. At the time, I was dealing with some on my own like mental stress of work and various things, and so taking that walk had other benefits. It ended up making it where like it kind of got some of those work stressors released by getting outside and walking. Other habits that formed after that were I started paying attention to other elements, like the data from my phone. I was trying to outperform that every day. And then
Okay.
by looking at that data, I started looking at other things like, how well am I eating? Or other things that where I started eating better. I just felt better in general, which then led over to taking more hikes and ultimately started a podcast around it called Deep in the Woods, which is
Hmm.
what really that one action of walking led to all of those other steps.
That's awesome.
So,
Yeah, that's quite a difference it made. Yeah. Yeah, one thing it did for me, and I'm not sure if this is good or bad, but I've shared before, maybe on here, maybe on my blog, wherever, that I'm not a big goal setter. I'm more of a big habit setter. Like I want to
okay.
just have routines. Like I mentioned to you before the call, I work out every morning with some of our mutual friends,
Yeah.
and I don't really have a goal to working out other than just to consistently do it and drive that habit. And this kind of sort of instill that in me that that's okay. Because there's sometimes you hear from some folks that
Yeah.
that's okay, and others like, no, you got to have big goals. And I certainly have some goals, but I found that just good habits, and like you said, habits can lead to other habits, can be a great thing, can be a good way to go through life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for whether it's through your job or through your personal life, I think habits can be a thing to add more to your life, but also, as it mentions in the book, it can remove behaviors that you don't want too.
Hmm.
So I think that's a part of it also. Like one example, I think it may be in this book. I also read, I don't know if you've heard of Tiny Habits and Atomic Habits.
Yep.
There's a series that came out
Oh yeah, a
back to
whole
back
bunch.
to back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I read all of them, but they're all very similar to the same. But I
Yep.
think one of them mentions like this donut. So this button that has a donut. So if you're sitting at your desk and this this button came down that was kind of an alarm that went off that said free donut, and you push that, every time you hit it, a donut would pop out, and so by doing that, you would get the donut, you would eat it, and then it would fulfill this craving, this desire that was able to go through that process. So the reward would be the sweet sugary treat, but the
Right.
trigger would be that button. And so the same thing of adding a trigger or to a cue or a prompt is the same thing. You can take that away as well. And so what I learned was I was a heavy soda drinker, and so
Hmm.
I was drinking Dr. Peppers all the time. And I realized like why can't I stop? And the reason was because they were available. And they were
Right.
always around. And so one thing I also learned from these books was removing that thing from being accessible was also a great piece of being able to get rid of behaviors that I don't want also.
Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to start doing that too. It's just stop buying them. Which is
Yes, right?
easier said than done sometimes. But yeah,
I
certainly
know, right?
be a great way to do it. Another thing I liked in here, they talked about Tony Dungy talked a little bit. He said, champions don't do extraordinary things. They do ordinary things, but they do them without thinking too fast for the other team to react. They follow the habits they've learned. And then I also picked up from another podcast I listened to called The Long and the Short of It. They said the point of practice and running all these drills and studying over and over again is so on game day, my only job is to react.
Yeah,
So I kind of
yeah.
like that where you build the habit so your only job is to react. You don't have to think about what to do, who to block, where to run. Like it's just going to happen automatically. You just have to be there to react because you've done the habits, if you've done the work ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that word you mentioned there is really the key, that automatic piece. I think whether it was from this or another, but I heard like a statistic that said 45% of our behaviors are automatic behaviors that come from habits.
Wow,
And
okay.
so throughout, what we do when when we get up in the morning, we grab our toothbrush, and the order we do it, the order we make our coffee, all of those things
Yeah,
are so
okay, that's true.
so automatic that they are just part of those simple routines. And one thing being thrown off, and that strategy, whatever it is, that in the morning, that routine aspect, if one of those things is thrown off, it can throw off the rest of the cycle.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think practicing, making things automatic and consistent, for my students, for myself, my family, I think even the way that my day works sometimes, like the way when I get home, all of that is definitely automatic behaviors.
Yeah. And now a lot of what you talked about, I think, is truly habits. The habit of brushing your teeth, and you do it this way and that way. I do wonder if Tony's thing is not really habits, though. Is that, and correct me, maybe we can poke at this a little bit, because it doesn't seem like a habit. It seems like practicing a lot and focusing on certain drills, but I see that as slightly different than a habit. I don't know. How do you see that? Do you see a difference there? Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's because you're talking about like already picking up on intuitive cues, almost
Right.
like
Is it a
because
habit
like
you do routinely without thinking, or is it something we're going to go practice this drill 20 times, which is great to do, but is that really the same as a habit?
I
I
think
don't
it's a
know.
little different, yeah,
Yeah.
because I think of like you mentioned in football, you're like training the brain to becoming hyper aware of scenarios so that you don't have to reason or break down the steps that you need. Like you said, the automatic piece,
Yep.
it happens. So I don't know if you would classify that as a habit, but it definitely picks it up into that automatic behavior piece where your brain doesn't have to process it and make decisions. Because I
Hmm.
think that's the key piece is that if you're there are other parts of your brain that are really good and need to be making decisions,
Right.
but you don't want that to be for every single action that you do. You want some things to be automatic.
Yep.
And so the things that you know are important that you want to get done correct every time, you want that thing to be the automatic brain, but you want the other part where the important decisions that come up to not be impacted by that other part.
Yeah,
So,
it's maybe a little bit like, so the book I did with our friend Tim on here was Thinking Fast and Slow, and I
mhm.
think it almost ties into that, where you want the slow thinking, the processing, all that to happen automatically from habits, and that way the fast part of your brain, the fast decision making, just happens because you just know what's going on. Reminds me a little bit too. I've been studying memory palaces a lot lately, just for memorizing facts and figures and stuff. It's an interesting concept, but part of it is you should know your palace that you put things in down pat. Like you shouldn't be thinking about that. You should just
Mhm.
learn that, make it a habit where it's just automatic, and that way when you're trying to put facts and figures into it, you can focus on the facts and figures and not be focusing on the framework around it, which is not unlike football, I think, where you do all the hard work to get all that figured out, and then when it's time to go, you can just focus on what's happening, on the field at that moment. And now that I think about it, I'm seeing that pop up more and more in life, where if you can get the frameworks and the basics memorized, have it done just automatic, it makes things go much easier because you can focus all your energy on the parts that cannot be automatic.
Yeah, what that makes me think of is, in a school setting, we talk about safety a lot, especially in regard to like school shootings. Like you
Hmm.
have all the drills and you have fire drills and so forth. But I
Yep.
remember in our safety briefings that we have probably once a month, one thing they always say is we want the core parts of the procedures down. Like we want,
Yep.
when this happens, when the crisis occurs, we want everyone to know these steps, right? Because there's going to come a part in this where there's going to be variables that happen. Like let's say it's a fire and this door is blocked, or let's say it's a shooter and you don't know if they're outside or inside the building. All
Hmm.
of those other questions that become more important, you don't want to have to start breaking down the small steps or um, the parts that should be intuitive. You don't want to have to break that down. You want to really stop and be able to make the priority decisions. So
Yep.
that's what it reminds me of
Yeah, I
too.
like that. Yeah,
So
very good example. I like that. Yeah, very similar. Another piece I've seen in other books before, a lot of you may have heard before, but I love the story of Target. I sort of hate the story of Target, but it's
yeah.
fascinating, where I'll kind of read the quote from the book. In the end, Target's analysis worked so well that it marketed to a pregnant teenage girl who hadn't yet told her family about her situation. Target sent her baby-related coupons, prompting her father to pay the local Target manager an angry visit. Quote, "She's still in high school. Are you going to encourage her to get pregnant?" When the truth came out, it was the abashed father's turn to apologize. And so it's just a note that, yeah, our habits and our actions can be almost so automatic that we don't even realize what we're doing, but others may see it around us. Well, I guess others with a lot of data on us maybe, but I mean, even our friends and family may see it to a degree.
Yeah, I think that data piece that you're talking about is really important with a business the because in the book he does talk about how keystone habits are impacting businesses. And
Hmm.
one example I will say is I take my dog to Tractor Supply to use their little bath stations.
Okay.
And so
Nice.
they have this place where you can take them, and it's $10. You can give them a bath.
Okay.
And when you go to ring up, they do the thing like they ask you about your rewards card. Well, the
Hmm.
last time I went, I noticed on their computer screen it said, "Did you ask the customer about the rewards card?" And it said yes or no. Like they had to actually click that button
Okay.
before they did it. So that was the habit. That was the trigger for them to
Yep.
be able to develop that habit. Well, for me, I only go there for one reason, and that's just to get my dog a bath.
Hmm.
Well, recently we needed to get a gate for our back fence, and the first place that came to my brain was Tractor Supply. Right, I could have went anywhere else, but there's
Right.
something
Yeah.
about the fact that they keep that name, that recognition in my head because they send emails out, and I get coupons because I'm a rewards member to get that dog bath.
Hmm.
But it was enough to work for me to be able to go and I bought a $150 gate for my backyard. So it did its job, just like Target did with trying to track and individualize customers. So
Yep. I like that. Very cool.
mhm.
One more piece here as we're starting to wrap up a little bit.
Sure.
I like this thought. This is one I hadn't really considered before. I like things that are obvious, but I'm like, I never really thought of that before, about habits occurring without our permission. So
Okay.
the quote from the book said, "Habits are powerful but delicate. They can emerge outside our consciousness or can be deliberately designed. They often occur without our permission, but can be reshaped by fiddling with their parts. They shape our lives far more than we realize. They are so strong. In fact, they cause our brains to cling to them at the exclusion of all else, including common sense. And so, yeah, I've never really thought about that. Like we talked here about how you shape your habits and you have the cues and all that stuff, but we all have a ton of habits that we've not shaped. They're just habits we've developed. And I think that's perhaps the best opportunity we have, is to look at all the habits we have automatically and think, if I thought about this habit, could I tweak it and make it more efficient or more pleasurable, or less work or something to make it better, just because it's happened without our permission, without us even thinking about it.
I think that as I was thinking about this interview, one of the things that kept coming to my mind was awareness. Like thinking about habits brings up awareness of so many things. And I think what you're saying there is really by being aware of how we are impacted by so many things in our environment, that really does, it makes us to become aware of these pieces that do influence our habits. Because when we think of students as teachers, we know we can't directly change behaviors, right? Because that piece is so intangible. It's like really so much part of the student, that you can't really just say do something different and then it becomes different. But you can impact the environment. Like that's why those cues that we place in their environment, that the beginning of a behavior and afterwards do have such a big impact in that developing that behavior, because it really does. It's the environmental aspects that really change the way we behave.
Yep.
So
yeah, well said. I like that. That's a great point. Any other highlights from the book you wanted to cover before we finish up?
The only other thing I was thinking about was there's a story, and this is kind of a business related one too, but it reminded me of how much like that keystone habit can impact organizations too. Was I think the company is Alcoa. But
okay, yeah, with Paul O'Neill, yeah,
Paul O'Neill. And so when he came into the company, he was really noticing there was a lot of safety concerns. And one of the things I thought was really neat was how he decided one thing was that anytime anyone saw a safety issue at all, he wanted to come straight to him, right? That the communication aspects, like not just went up to this one level above or the next manager, it had to go from the worker all the way to the CEO because he wanted to address that. Yep. So that one behavior, one habit change impacted the communication. They were learning how to be more efficient with how communication worked. It impacted the morale of the company because the employees were realizing that the company really wanted them to be safe. But so that story really stuck out to me, that there's this one decision to be able to look at the safety really impacted so many areas, like a domino effect. And so that was definitely another area that I thought would be important to share, because it's just one decision and it really shows the ripple effect of what can occur from that.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that's the one, if I remember correctly, that he came in and said, we're going to have 0 injuries. And people are like, what are you talking about? Like, we should lower it some, but 0 is a little crazy talk.
Yeah.
And that's what he went for, and that's what he eventually got, because that became the focus of what they did, versus some are okay if we need to be efficient. He said, no, we're just, 0 is the goal. Yeah. And it's a whole different approach. It, again, shapes how people work and behave, and I'm sure changed some habits on how lax they get about certain things, and sort of force that change upon people without directly changing their habits, but just saying, to get this goal, you're gonna have to change some habits to make it happen. So
and their profits went up too, which they didn't expect. So
right, that was you wouldn't expect. You would think they would profits would get hurt because of that a little bit. Like we're gonna be a little bit less efficient, but be safe. It's a good trade off. We'll lose some money, but win-win. So kudos to him for that. So awesome. Well, Andrew, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you coming on. How can people track you down online?
So my podcast is Deep in the Woods. It's you can find it on any podcast place like Apple Podcast. I also share some things on Instagram. My podcast, what makes it unique is that we take a guest out on a walk. So they find a place that they find to be significant, and they pick one word that they think is important to them also. So from your friend Tim, I know he won't mind me calling him out here. He picked the word belonging.
Okay, that tracks.
And and we went over to Kennesaw Mountain over here in Kennesaw, Georgia, and we spent about an hour or so walking. And as we walked, we recorded at the same time, and we talk about the word belonging and how all of that connects to what's important to the guest and to myself as well, because we both were really discussing education and how that applies to that. But awesome. There's all kinds of words. I've talked about walking, inclusion. I've even talked about genetics. So it really every podcast is a little different. So you can check it out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you look at my Instagram, you can also see pictures of the places that we go to.
Awesome, very cool. Yeah, I'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes so y'all can check it out. So
all right,
cool. Appreciate it, Andrew. This was great. Thank you.
Right. I appreciate letting me be a part.
Awesome. Thank you. See ya.